Hey, welcome to the Groundswell podcast. I'm Elliot Sands, Executive Director of Faith First, and I'm with Terence Lester, founder of Love Beyond Walls and the author of multiple books, including All God's Children, How Confronting Buried History Can Build Racial Solidarity. Terence, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Elliot, I am excited to be here. We were just talking offline, man, and it just seems like you have a very warm and inviting heart and spirit, man. So I'm grateful to be on this podcast with you.
Yeah, no, I've enjoyed the first 15 minutes already, and we haven't even started recording. So this is going to be good. It's pretty good. So you're in Atlanta right now, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay.
Not only am I in Atlanta, I'm actually an Atlanta native, which is very rare. They say we are rare sightings here.
That is true for Californians and even folks from the Bay Area. Like when you ever get in a room and there's more than one of you, you're like, how did this happen? Like there's not many of us out there. So, well,
Right.
with that, tell us a little bit about your story. Where were you born? We know where you're born. You're born in Atlanta. Okay. Where were you raised? Tell us a little bit about your upbringing. What brought you here today? Some of those things. Love to hear your story.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been here in the city. I was raised by my mother, who was, a single parent that really gave me a lot of tough love. I was surrounded around a community that I would consider very nurturing in that of my grandmothers and my grandfathers. But I had a couple of experiences here that, kind of landed me on the streets early on, as early as age 16 and a half. I was sleeping in parks and over friends' houses and all types of things. And I think those initial touch points with the experience of homelessness kind of led me to meeting one of my friend's fathers, which his name was Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore became a mentor to me as early as age 16 and a half, 17 years old. And he was one of the people outside of my mother that really encouraged me to finish school, to go on. He was the guy that I called and I was like, should I marry her? Right. And then 17 years later, I'm still married to her, right? Which is my beautiful wife, Cecilia. We have two children, Zion and Terrence, TJ. But yeah, I mean, just kind of like staying close to some of the people in the community who began to see the best in me, call out the goodness or the potential that I had, and really encouraged me to overcome a lot of the odds that were stacked against me. I grew up in a pretty impoverished neighborhood and was just exposed to a lot of things early on. But, thankful for my grandmother, the love that she provided for me and those who had come into my life really kind of shaped me into who I am today. About 10 years ago, Mr. Moore, right before he passed away, he encouraged me to continue to go to school. And, he said that one day I would be able to start an organization. So I started Love Beyond Walls about 10 years ago, which is a nonprofit organization that advocates on behalf of those who are unhoused and also shows up in ways that causes people to come together from totally ends of the spectrum, right, to opposite ends of the spectrum, bringing people in close proximity with one another because we're centered around building relationships with those who are unhoused and really showing up with resources. And I like to say that resources are just vehicles for us to be in relationship with people. And yeah, I mean, I've done a lot over the last decade, and I just feel like my heart is bent towards service, however I can serve people.
And reading your book, sounds like when you jump into something, you jump in with both feet. That you're not
I've been
messing
known for that.
around. Yeah, solidarity is a big word that you use, and how that works in the homeless or unhoused community, but then of course with the
Yeah.
African American community. So that's Really cool. And I really want to talk a little bit later about community and like how that helps to build bridges and so on. Obviously, you're the story or the product of a community, whether it's your family, your mom, your grandma, and so on, and even your grandpa to some degree, and the rest of your family. And then, of course, sounds like Mr. Moore had a amazing impact on your life as well. One of the things that you drew out in your book a lot was that concept of being seen and
Mm.
how important that is. And so, and you again, interestingly, in your book, you kind of bring analogies between your experiences with the homeless, the unhoused community, and then the African American community. Would you tell me a little bit about what that means to be seen and this, how important that is, and like what are little things we can do to make sure that those around us are being seen?
Yeah. I mean, you ever had someone or a group of people stand around you, either in a community event or some type of gathering, and all of your humanity is there, your inherent worth and value, your dignity, but somehow this group misses the essence of that worth and value wrapped up in to all of who you are. um, that has happened to me several times, walking into spaces and having people ignore me because of my skin color, or having, women clutch their purses because of my skin color. I remember one time I was invited out as a nonprofit leader to one of these massive events where they're, distributing items to nonprofit leaders. I was the only Black man or leader in that context. And afterwards, they were loading up box trucks, and all of these white men were standing around. And I was in the group, and I was just thanking them. And a middle-aged white woman walks up to me and asks me for a trash bag because she assumed that I was the janitor. You know, I've been put out of or asked to leave places for having on attire that was deemed quote unquote inappropriate, like a hoodie or things like that. And so, you know, being unseen in many ways is a constant battle of harm. And the reason why I use the word harm is because, being unseen is violent in many ways, because it creates this sense of invisibility that hovers over you like a cloud, like a dark cloud, where everywhere you go, you're wondering, am I good enough? Do I belong? Am I good enough to be in this space? And you wrestle with all of those emotions. Will people fear me, right? Will I be viewed in a certain lens or perspective? I have a PhD, right? And I still can walk into places and be treated or seen as being lesser because of the skin that I'm in. But doing the work that I've done with Love Beyond Walls, one of the reasons why I chose to use a lot of the language from the unhoused community is because, for a decade, that's been my entire life. How can we cause people to see the value, the humanity, the inherent dignity and worth of our unhoused citizens? How can we use that as a way to build empathy and compassion instead of creating laws that publicly sanitizes them, having a perspective filled with fear, looking through a lens of a criminal lens where when you see this community, you have a criminal ideology wrapped around how you have been socially framed to engage with or walk away from this community. How can we know the stories, right? How can we really know who people are apart from our um, embedded ideas about who people are? And so a large part of my work has always been centered around how can we be more proximate? How can I know the story of the people that I'm actually saying is a part of the beloved community? How can I know their dreams and their hopes and their historical shaping? How can I know how they arrived, where they arrived, and how can I embody the love of God in a way that causes me to love people where they are? And I think one of the greatest disconnects that we don't see or don't understand sometimes is we all want to be seen
Mm,
in some way
mm.
in our families, in our communities, in at our jobs, right? In our friendships, in our relationships. We want to even have the courage to see ourselves, even when we don't measure up to the expectations that we have. And so we're always wrestling with what it means to be seen. But somehow that stops, right? Or hinders or halts itself when it comes to those who may be unhoused or a part of the BIPOC community, whether they're Black, Indigenous, Pacific Islander, or Asian, right? And so, like, we have to really think about the ways in which we see other people and create belonging for people that we come in contact with.
That is so good. The word that just keeps coming to mind as you're describing this is that we like to live in generalities because it's easier. But we also realize we accept the fact that we're nuanced, like that I am a nuanced human being. Like I acknowledge, like, oh, and in this space, that might make me grumpy, or in this space, that makes me happy, or, and my story is. And then when it gets to some of these larger populations, we'll keep picking on the homeless population. We just lose that idea of nuance, and it all goes to generality. Well, they're all, and then you fill in the blank for all the reasons that we can make up why they might be where they are right now. And
Mhm.
it's just it's just false. And I think we should all intuitively know that, but it's just so much easier to just get rid of nuance and live in generalities. And yet, if we truly want to show the love of Jesus, if we truly want people to be seen, we have to see other humans as nuanced individuals. Um,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
and again, it's easier to do generalities. Like that is the simpler way, because I can think of all the ways to fix homelessness if it's all just a generality. But if I realize that every human there is nuanced, you realize that solutions aren't simple, and then that makes it challenging. And then you just kind of, you can tend to walk away from it because it's just too big. But
yeah. I mean, that is so that is so spot on in terms of the complexity of the human experience, period, right? Um, that's not to say that there aren't general things, but normally when we talk in generalities, those things are really surface, right? Earlier, you said you were talking about your daughter just gone to college, and she came in contact with someone that's a longtime friend. Said, "My dad has that shirt, right?" That's kind of like a generality, right? And nothing is wrong with the aesthetics, but when you really dig deeper into what shapes a person, their experience, the intersections that they wrestle with in terms the intersectional nature of who they are as a person, right? Because even if we talk about, homelessness, what if you're Black and homeless? What if you're Black, homeless, and disabled, right? And so there are many different identities that have, many different layers that we can kind of drill down and down and down to unpack the complexities of that one experience. Well, the same could be true if you're Asian, right? If you're Indigenous, if you're Pacific Islander, if you are a Black man in this country, right? And so there are a lot of systemic factors that could play a part in, the nuanced experiences that each person may possess. And the reason why I think it's so important to embody this sense of proximity and solidarity is because it gives you the type of proximity that is not performative, right? Um, it's not something that just is cognitive, right? Where you can rationalize away who you haven't been proximate to because you're still at a distance, right? But when you really embody what proximity and solidarity is asking us to do, it's asking us to lament with people, right? It's asking us to be proximate enough where we understand the cries, the concerns, the hurts, the harms that a person may possess, and they may not even be your hurts. But the simple fact that you're in close proximity with this person or a group of people, it opens up your heart to see the world from another perspective that you may not have considered, right? And so, I think when we think about things like solidarity or genuinely listening to others without this posture of wanting to edit their experience, right? Like these are the types of things that allow us to understand the things that we may overlook because of distance. That's kind of like what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah. You touched on something that I had well down the list of my questions for you today. But since you already brought it up,
Yeah.
would you step into lament a little bit for me? Explain that to me. That's not something that I really grew up in my tradition with. A lament a lot. That wasn't part of my church experience.
Yeah.
And so it's something that I've learned to step into, but I'm also learning to step into. And would
Yeah.
you describe it a little bit? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean the lament looks like the Psalms, right? It looks like lamentation, which is highly biblical. Um, a lot of the Psalms can contain these deep sorrow cries and responses to God. God, my enemies surround me. God, like I'm I'm perplexed. David does a lot of this in the ways in which he writes, I'm at war with myself. He talks about things in a way that gives validation to the human suffering experience. Um, but then they're followed up with these beautiful words in trust of God's sovereignty and God's ability to move in certain situations, or the trust, you know, in God beyond our doubts and our disbeliefs and all of those things. I think lament is highly biblical because um, it gives us space to just be human before God. We are not perfect. Um, and we have an opportunity to bring our sorrows to a sovereign God, right? And so that's how I see lament, but I see lament fleshing out in like the right nowness of time. It's like if we see someone who goes um and is murdered, right? Um at the hands of someone in power like law enforcement that is black, or we see an Asian business get shot up, right? Uh with an AR-15, or if we see a unhoused person go without a meal and they have more policies that exclude than actual beds in a city that provides shelter. Like I lament to God, like I have to cry out, because if I don't cry out, it harbors frustration and anger and bitterness. And lament gives us an opportunity to really be real with what we are suffering with. So when my brother or sister comes and stands in solidarity with me and they lament from the racial trauma I experienced, from just watching images or seeing the ways in which really tense things are talking about, they cry out with me and call it wrong. They cry out with me and say, Lord, we don't know. They cry out with me in frustration that this shouldn't be. And we acknowledge the fact that God is not pleased by it.
that's super helpful. When you're talking about that, I'm picturing John 11:36. I think that's the verse, but when Jesus wept, the shortest verse in the Bible, right?
Yes.
Death of his brother, his friend Lazarus. And
Mm, mm, that's perfect.
and I've seen it spoken that the reason he did, and we don't know all the reasons, but I think one of the reasons could be is that he was at creation. Jesus was at creation. He knew this was not the way it was supposed to be. This young man was not supposed to die. Sickness and
Mm,
evil, and that same sickness and evil resides in our world today, and it comes out in the things that you've described around Black hate, Asian hate, treating other humans inhumanely. Um, and I love what you said, that there has to be a moment of humanness where we go, I don't care what your political views are. I don't care what your background is. I don't, you have to say that that's not okay. Like there has to be a piece of you that just sits in the fact that that ain't okay. Like it's just not. That's not the way God intended it
yeah.
to be. That's not the way we would really want our world to be. If you, I think, I hope. And so, can we sit in that for a moment? And I think part of my tradition growing up is, my wife's and I's joke is like, you just buck up, like it's just deal with it, like just move on. And that's what her dad would tell her from time to time if she wasn't feeling well. She's like, yeah, you're gonna be fine, buck up, move on, go take a shower, put your makeup on, you're gonna be okay. And the point is sometimes you have to sit in it, like sometimes and that's okay to sit in it. There should be a time frame where you move out of it, but there's still, it's okay to acknowledge that what's happening isn't okay. Like that's actually probably a really psychologically healthy thing for us to just to sit in.
Yeah.
This isn't right.
Yeah. I mean, man, I think about Emmett Till, right? And um, when his life was taken and his mom decided to Mamie Till have an open casket for the world to see what hatred had done to her son, which became one of the inspirations surrounding the Montgomery bus boycott, right? Because Black people were told to get to the back of the bus in the Jim Crow South, which became, one of the leading factors of policy being passed that banned, this discrimination. And so crying out has its place. It's not just about sitting in grief, but allowing grief to speak in a way that warrants change. And we have to be bold and courageous enough to ask, how might I change? How might I stand alongside someone who has a different experience from me to understand with solidarity and empathy so I can stand alongside them, right? Because a part of lamenting leads to listening. And a part of that listening leads to that learning phase that I talk about in the book in terms of the solidarity framework. And then this kind of is an open invitation to really immerse yourself in the world of another. I'll never forget when I was working on my doctoral work, one of the foundational courses before I get into my specific area was called Engaging Differences. I'll never forget the first time we had class and Dr. Flickinger was going over the syllabus and she mentioned all of these papers, but the most important paper had to be an entire 20 plus page paper about your experience that you spent with another group of people who weren't like you, who didn't have the same experiences that you had, not the same historical shaping, culturally don't eat the same foods. Like, I mean, you go down the list. And so, man, when you think about that immersiveness, that is what Jesus did, right? John 1. And the word became flesh and did what? Dwelt among them. Wow. And then you skip over to Hebrews, it says, we do not have a high priest that can't sympathize and empathize with our earthly sufferings, right? And so when you think about the witness and life of Jesus, it just gives so much context as to how we're supposed to immerse ourselves and model what it means to stand with other people. You know, Jesus has so many beautiful statements throughout scripture that models what it means to be immersed. And I think out of that, right, Matthew 9, it says he saw, a group of people who were weary, right, lost, like a sheep without a shepherd. And the very next verse, it says, with compassion. That's because contextually, Jesus was there. He was proximate and he was standing with people, that were in need of relationship with, to have relationship with. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. That is really good.
I don't mean to preach, man, but I a lot of this stuff derives from out of the way I look at Jesus in the scriptures, you know? And if Jesus is the goal of how I should, live my life in terms of, personal and practical ways, I mean, I can't turn water into wine. I can't do some of the things, but like I can mine a lot of wisdom with the way that Jesus engaged people. And I think that's just what I'm after. That's what I'm getting at, the ways in which he knew people, he knew their stories, and he had so much grace in their presence that they never felt like they needed to run away.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So true. And you can preach anytime you like. So just feel free. If something comes up, you just keep that going. No, it's so good. And I want to move past lament, but to say lament should move to action. And I think this is one of the
Yeah.
things where there can be a disconnect in the church, because sometimes lament moves to a Bible study in a community group. And now we're just going to sit around and talk about it. And then it doesn't necessarily lead to doing something about it. Like there's not an action step out of it. It's just more like, oh, well, let's understand the problem better. And it becomes more like a deliberation than it does okay, I think we got enough of what the problem is here. Like, can we now take action? So when you talk about solidarity and you have your solidarity framework, one of the things you talk about is use your voice. So you start with lament, listen, learn, immerse, show compassion and empathy, stand alongside others, and then use your voice. Y'all go buy the book and you'll get a lot more detail on that. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about when you say use your voice, what does that mean to you? What does that look like? How can we use our voice in a way that's forward moving and helpful?
Yeah. I can give you like a practical example, right? And so I was um I was I was tasked with finding a policy problem because my concentration for my research was public policy, and I've looked at social constructionism as it relates to those who are unhoused, how we came to ideas about, people who are unhoused moving from a communal concern to the criminality of it, right? And how the rhetoric around this subject produces public policy that sanitizes people and um, disrupts their sense of belonging and impacts their sense of self-worth. And so I found the state of Tennessee. Tennessee had just passed a law in July, July 1st, 2022, that literally makes camping outside or sleeping outside a felony. A felony. So hear me again, a felony, which is punishable up to 6 years for not having anywhere to go. I peeled back the layer a little deeper and found out there were more people who are unhoused than actual beds offered, right? And so I go to my professor and I say, hey, I think this is going to be the grounding of my research. This is what I'm focusing my entire dissertation on. And I want to employ a methodology that is partial creative. And so for my dissertation, I went over to Tennessee. I lived on the streets and I shot a documentary because I wanted to know what was the impact of how public policy was causing harm to a person's sense of self-worth and how that was stripping people from belonging in the community because you're a neighbor whether you have an address or not, right? Jesus said foxes have holes, birds of hair have nests. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. But later in the same book, he says, love God with everything and your neighbor as yourself, right? And so I started doing these street interviews. I turned it into a film, and I met this group, Open Table Nashville. One of the leaders, her name is Lindsay. She's a activist. She's a white woman, and met her team. And she started talking to me about another policy that was about to be passed that would further impact the group. And so through data and research, we were able to bring a lot of awareness to actually stop one of these things that could impact the community even more. And not only did that awareness stop it, but it galvanized more support around their efforts to actually provide relief and development for the unhoused community. And when I say action or activism, I'm asking myself, in what practical ways can I act to either mitigate or correct an injustice or wrong that is being done, right? Sometimes it's picking up the phone and making phone calls. Sometimes it's going out to stand with people who are, you know, having a forum around a certain subject. Sometimes it's volunteerism at an organization who already has something in motion. Sometimes that looks like the ministry of presence, right? Going to sit with people. Sometimes it's rallying your own group of people to raise resources for an issue. Sometimes it's being generous and donating your funds. Sometimes it's using your voice against ideas that help uphold the mistreatment of those who may be vulnerable. And so, I can't give like a prescriptive solution, but what I can do is say, what comes to your heart? What makes you mad? One of my earlier mentors would break that down and says, MAD stands for make a difference. The things that upset you is a clear call, right? Or an indication of the area in which you should give your time, talent, and treasure with it is the idea of service. And so, what is upsetting you? What rises to your heart? But also, what is around you geographically, right? Because you have to also know what issues are right around you in your region. It would be foolish of me to provide relief after a natural disaster to an area where the natural disaster never occurred, right? And so I need to really figure out, I need to do my homework about my neighborhood, about my neighbors, about issues that are being faced by people that I may overlook because they're just not in my sphere of influence. Using your voice is also about humbling yourself and opening up yourself enough to learn what's outside your world.
Thank you. That's good. That's good. And no matter where you live, no matter where you're listening to this at, there are things in your community.
Yeah.
There are ills, and it's not just a big city thing. I live in San Jose. San Jose in and of itself has a ton of stuff. But you even in smaller cities, smaller towns, there's still stuff. There's still stuff that needs to be addressed. And so I love that idea of how do you do research and find the organizations that are doing well. And here's the thing is if somebody were to come to you from Atlanta and say, "Hey, would can I buy you coffee and you tell me a little bit about the unhoused population?" My guess as an executive director of an organization that works on that, you'd find time for coffee. Just to have that conversation. Like, let me tell you, I'm kind of an insider here because I do this every day. I can let you know a little bit about what's happening in Atlanta in this realm. And so if you're out there, I encourage you. There's a lot of good organizations doing a lot of good organizations, secular and Christian, doing stuff, and they're
Yeah.
always looking for people to come alongside with just the things you've said. So that's great. That's really good.
There is always a need to be filled. And I think most times people are afraid because they think they have to become something else to meet the need. But in reality, you already have things, gifts, a professional life, right? Unique experiences, expertise in certain areas that you can bring as a resource to people who are doing the work, people who are in need, people, organizations who are in need, and I think about it as the things that you're good at can be someone's answer to a struggle that they might be facing, right? And when you think about it in that way, it's like, it takes the pressure off for you to have to become something that you're not. Just be who you are, but offer up what you have in service to others.
That's so good. That's so good. I just think of serving in a church, and sometimes everybody's like, "Dude, I don't like kids. I don't want to serve in children's ministry. Is there something else in children's ministry to do?" And it's like, God created you in a certain way. Like in the Silicon Valley, all kinds of engineers here, right? Like,
Right, right,
guys like, yet we like part of another nonprofit also helping with alleviating poverty here in Silicon Valley. Some of our greatest volunteers are the guys who are helping to build the website and helping to build like out like how to
right.
distribute our training materials and all of those types of things. Like, yes, that guy who knows how to do a website, yeah, you use that skill. Like there's a place for that. And so I think that's so freeing because sometimes you feel like, well, I'm going to have to go outside of my skill set and my giftings in order to actually make a difference. And that's not altogether true. God created you in a perfect, special way to actually address these things that He's put in your heart that are already bothering you. Like something
Right,
you see that is an ill in your society, God's already given you what you need to contribute to that. And it may not look like the way you're fearing it's going to look like. Like it actually
right.
it's like a glove. And you're like, oh, this is amazing. And it's not. It shouldn't be fearful. It actually should be joyful, right? So,
Right, right.
um, I think I'm going to close this up with our final question. I literally have 6 other questions that I wanted to ask you today, but I love kind of the track we've gone down. I think this is really, really fun. Um, what I'd like to ask you, this is what we do on this podcast. The last question is, what's exciting you right now? Is there a Bible verse? Is there something happening in your home with your family? Is there something at work? Is there something you look at and like when I think about that, I am encouraged, and I might be it might be daunting, but it's something that I'm smiling about when I think. So, what's encouraging you in your life right now?
Yeah, man. In transparency, man, I last year is May of 2022. My wife and I were involved in a near fatal car accident. Um, I had to spend a month in the hospital. Got out. They told me it would be a year and a half before I could walk again. I crushed my hip and my pelvis, and man, I remember being in bed, 4 or 5 months, not being able to do anything like walk to the restroom on my own, go outside, feed myself. I was taking, 20 plus medications per day just to cope with um, the pain level, which still only reduced it just a small bit. And I'll never forget. I was talking to my wife, um, and I say, "Man, I don't feel like I'm worth it anymore, right?" This happened at the height of my career. I feel speaking all over, writing all over, and then she looks at me and she says, "Your worth is not tied to your mobility or what you do, but it's just in who you are. And you may not have um, momentum right now or mobility, but you still have your mind, right?" She became the reason why I finished my book. I was writing that book that you read, All God's Children, while laying in the bed, unable to walk and move. And um, I finished my dissertation, right? All of my written dissertation from the bed in a wheelchair. And, even now, a year ago to date, I was still using forearm crutches and walkers and wheelchairs to this date, right? Last year. And today I can walk on my own, move around on my own, but I'm just getting to the place again where I feel um, empowered and hopeful beyond sorrow and beyond grief. And if anybody that might be listening to this who are just not only overwhelmed with the problems of the world, but just overwhelmed in your own sense of loss or trauma or grief, um, that there is still hope.
So good. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for
Yeah,
I have a few people in mind right now that I will I will make sure they hear that it's tough when you're so used to your body just working.
yep,
We do tie our worth and our value to what we're able to accomplish, and
yep,
kind of who appreciates us. And
yep,
so thank you for sharing that. I appreciate
yeah,
that.
for sure.
And thank you for joining the podcast today. It has been a blessing to hear your story, a little bit of your story, and to hear your insights. I've enjoyed this conversation tremendously. So thanks for being here. And for everybody out there today, go live faith first.